Amidst the ruins of a once thriving Soviet city on the banks of the Volga, the fate of the world's greatest war was decided. The Battle of Stalingrad was not merely a clash of armies, it was a brutal test of endurance, where rubble became trenches, factories turned into fortresses, and every street, building, and even stairwell was fought over in blood. Between the summer of 1942 and the winter of 1943, Adolf Hitler's mighty Wehrmacht and Joseph Stalin's Red Army engaged in a titanic struggle that cost over 2 million lives. From desperate last stands in crumbling apartment blocks to the thunder of Soviet counteroffensives, the story of Stalingrad is both horrifying and awe-inspiring. The moment when Nazi Germany's advance was stopped and the tide of World War II began to turn. The German invasion of the Soviet Union, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, began on June 22, 1941. It was the largest invasion in military history. Over 1 million German soldiers and Axis allies, supported by tanks, artillery, and aircraft, surged eastward across a 1,800-mile front. Hitler's objective was not just military conquest, but the destruction of the Soviet state and the enslavement of its people. In the opening months, the Wehrmacht achieved astonishing success. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and annihilated in vast pocket battles. German panzers rolled through Ukraine, Belarus, and deep into Russia. Cities like Smolensk, Kiev, and Kharkov fell. By October, German troops stood at the gates of Moscow. The world held its breath, believing the Soviet Union might collapse. Yet the Red Army did not break. In the winter of 1941-42, the Germans were repelled outside Moscow in a counter-offensive that shocked the world. For the first time, the Wehrmacht had been stopped, but Hitler was determined to renew the attack. In 1942, the German High Command turned its eyes to the south. The objectives were twofold: capture the oil fields of the Caucasus, whose vast resources would fuel Germany's war machine; seize the city of Stalingrad, both a vital industrial hub and a symbolic prize bearing Stalin's own name. Hitler believed that by seizing Stalingrad, he would deal a psychological blow to the Soviets and secure the eastern flank for the Caucasus oil campaign. Thus began the road to one of the most savage battles in history. The summer of 1942 blazed across the Eastern Front. After the harsh winter battles outside Moscow, Hitler regrouped his forces for a new offensive. His eyes no longer focused on the Soviet capital. Instead, he aimed south, toward the oil-rich Caucasus and the strategic river city of Stalingrad. The new offensive was codenamed Case Blue, Fall Blau. Its objectives were ambitious: secure the oil of Baku and Grozny, and seize Stalingrad to cut Soviet communications along the Volga River. Hitler believed that controlling these resources would cripple the Soviet war effort while giving Germany the fuel to continue its conquests indefinitely. The German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, was chosen to lead the assault on Stalingrad. Behind him stood one of the finest armies ever assembled, experienced, battle-hardened veterans of earlier victories. Morale was high, for after a year of fighting, the Wehrmacht still appeared unbeatable. But cracks were already forming. The German supply lines stretched dangerously thin. Their allies, Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian divisions, were brave but less well-equipped and poorly trained compared to the Germans. These weaknesses would later prove fatal. In June 1942, German panzers thundered across the steppe. Dust rose in clouds as tanks, trucks, and horse-drawn wagons pushed eastward. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies, striking Soviet positions with devastating precision. Soviet forces, battered from the previous year, fell back under the relentless assault. The Germans captured Voronezh and swept toward the Don River. Villages and towns burned as they passed, leaving behind a trail of destruction. In their path lay the Red Army, retreating but not broken, regrouping for the defense of their homeland. By late August, the Germans stood before Stalingrad, a sprawling industrial city stretched along the western bank of the Volga River. Its factories produced tractors, tanks, and weapons, a vital lifeline for the Soviet war machine. More than that, it bore the name of Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader himself. For Hitler, taking Stalingrad was not just a military objective, but a symbolic one. On August 23, 1942, the Luftwaffe unleashed one of the most devastating bombing raids of the war. Thousands of tons of bombs fell on Stalingrad, reducing entire districts to rubble. Fires raged for days, black smoke rising like a funeral shroud over the city. Tens of thousands of civilians perished in the inferno. Yet what the Germans believed would be a quick conquest was about to turn into a nightmare. The rubble that filled Stalingrad's streets created a natural fortress for its defenders. Instead of cowing the Soviet people, the destruction hardened their resolve. As Soviet propaganda thundered, "There is no land beyond the Volga," Stalin issued Order Number 227 in July 1942. Not a step back. Any soldier who retreated without orders faced execution. Entire blocking detachments were placed behind Soviet lines to shoot deserters. Harsh as it was, the order symbolized the determination that the city would be defended at any cost. Under the command of General Zhukov, the Soviet 62nd Army prepared to resist. Civilians dug trenches, laid mines, and carried ammunition. Workers in the city's factories continued producing weapons even as bombs fell around them. Women, old men, and children all played their part. Stalingrad would not fall easily. As Paulus's 6th Army crossed the Don and pushed toward the city, the world watched. Newspapers in Berlin declared that Stalingrad would soon be in German hands, but in Moscow, Stalin prepared for a fight to the death. The stage was set. In a matter of days, the German 6th Army would enter Stalingrad, and the greatest battle of the Second World War was about to begin. The date was September 1942. The German 6th Army, confident from months of victories, entered the outskirts of Stalingrad. What they expected was another swift triumph. A city crushed beneath the Luftwaffe's bombs, its defenders scattered. What they encountered instead was hell on earth. Stalingrad was no longer a city in the traditional sense. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble heaps. Factories stood as skeletons, their walls shattered but their steel framework still looming against the sky. Streets were filled with debris, burned-out vehicles, and the corpses of civilians who had not escaped the initial bombing. Yet the destruction favored the defenders. Every pile of bricks became a barricade, every ruined basement a bunker, every shattered apartment a fortress. The Germans quickly discovered that tanks and artillery, which had served them so well on the open steppe, were nearly useless in the city's narrow streets and ruined blocks. At first, the German infantry pushed forward with confidence. Backed by tanks and artillery, they advanced through the shattered districts of Stalingrad. By mid-September, they had captured much of the city's western outskirts and were pressing toward the Volga. But as they advanced, resistance stiffened. Soviet snipers hid in the shadows of ruined buildings, firing with deadly precision. Mines and booby traps slowed progress. Entire German squads disappeared in ambushes staged from basements and attics. A German officer wrote in his diary, "Every street is a fortress, every house a machine gun nest. The enemy hides everywhere, and when we clear one building, they emerge from the sewers behind us. This is not war. It is the end of the world." The defenders of Stalingrad were the 62nd Army, commanded by General Vasily Zhukov. Zhukov was a hard, ruthless man, perfectly suited for the brutal kind of warfare Stalingrad demanded. He ordered his soldiers to fight not for meters of ground, but for each wall, each staircase, each room. His strategy was called hugging the enemy. Soviet troops fought at such close range that German artillery and air support became useless for fear of hitting their own men. Factories such as the Red October steel plant, the Barricadi ordnance factory, and the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory became battlegrounds. Soldiers fought among assembly lines, around half-finished tanks, and through workshops filled with molten steel and twisted machinery. The fighting in Stalingrad was unlike anything the world had seen before. The city had become a furnace of destruction, a place where human endurance was tested beyond all limits. What Hitler had believed would be a quick victory had instead become a quagmire, sucking in men and resources at a staggering rate. One of the most famous aspects of the Battle of Stalingrad was the sniper duels. Soviet marksmen such as Vasily Zaitsev became legends. Hidden in the rubble, they picked off German officers, tank crews, and machine gunners with terrifying efficiency. Zaitsev is said to have killed over 200 Germans during the battle. His story became a symbol of Soviet resilience, a morale booster for soldiers and civilians alike. Unlike most battles, Stalingrad had no clear front lines. Germans might hold the ground floor of a building, Soviets the upper floors, and fighting would rage in the stairwells between. Sewer tunnels were used as highways by Soviet troops, allowing them to appear behind German lines unexpectedly. Grenades, knives, bayonets, and even shovels became as important as rifles. Soldiers spoke of Rattenkrieg, rat war, a savage struggle fought in darkness, filth, and suffocating closeness. Despite being surrounded on three sides, the Soviets maintained a lifeline across the Volga River. At night, under heavy German artillery fire, small boats ferried reinforcements, ammunition, and supplies to the defenders. Thousands of soldiers of the Red Army crossed under fire, often without rifles, waiting to pick up weapons from the fallen. Women and children helped unload supplies. Nurses carried the wounded back across the river, often under strafing from German planes. To defend the crossing, Soviet anti-aircraft crews, many of them young women, fired their guns until they were destroyed, buying time for the city. By late September, the Germans controlled much of Stalingrad's center. The Soviet defenders were pushed back to a thin strip of land along the Volga's west bank. Yet still, they refused to break. For the Germans, every block captured cost hundreds of lives. For the Soviets, every meter of ground lost was bought back with blood. General Zhukov later recalled, "We defended not a city, but every brick, every beam, every piece of soil. We buried our dead in the ruins and fought on over their bodies." The fighting in Stalingrad was unlike anything the world had seen before, yet the worst was still to come. The Soviets were not merely defending Stalingrad, they were preparing a trap. By October 1942, the city of Stalingrad had become a nightmare for both sides. The Luftwaffe continued to pound the ruins daily. German artillery leveled whole districts, and the Volga ran red with blood. Yet the Soviet defense did not falter. Instead, it hardened into an iron will that would become one of the defining features of the battle. The defenders of Stalingrad lived like phantoms among the rubble. Many had no proper shelters, sleeping in basements filled with dust and the stench of the dead. Rats swarmed the ruins, feeding on corpses. Ammunition was scarce, and food often consisted of meager rations of bread mixed with sawdust or soup made from boiled leather. Civilians who had not been evacuated fought alongside soldiers. Women worked as medics, snipers, and supply runners, darting across streets under fire. Even children were pressed into service, carrying ammunition belts or serving as lookouts. A Soviet survivor later recalled, "We had nothing but rubble and corpses around us, but still, we would not let them take the city. We would rather die in the ruins than let Hitler claim Stalingrad." For the Germans, the battle turned from rapid conquest into a grinding war of attrition. The Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, found itself bleeding men in horrific numbers. Every time a factory or building was taken, Soviet counterattacks clawed it back. Entire companies of German soldiers were wiped out trying to seize a single block. General Paulus wrote in a report, "Our losses are beyond anything we have experienced. Each street consumes battalions, each house a company. The enemy will not yield." The German troops, exhausted and demoralized, gave names to key strongpoints. The grain elevator, Pavlov's house, the Red October factory. These places became synonymous with death. One of the most famous examples of Soviet resilience was Pavlov's house. Sergeant Yakov Pavlov and his men seized an apartment block overlooking a strategic square. For nearly 2 months, with about 24 men, Pavlov held off repeated German assaults. The defenders fortified the building with machine guns, barbed wire, and mines, turning it into a fortress. At night, they received supplies across the Volga. The Germans threw tanks, infantry, and artillery at the building, but it stood firm. It was said among Soviet soldiers that it was harder for the Germans to take Pavlov's house than the entire city of Paris. The industrial districts became battlefields unlike any the world had seen. In the tractor factory, workers had continued assembling tanks until the fighting reached the assembly halls. Then, Half-finished vehicles were crewed by soldiers and driven straight from the factory floor into battle. The Barricadi factory was fought over inch by inch. German troops captured workshops by day, only to be pushed out at night by Soviet counterattacks. The roar of machinery was replaced by the thunder of grenades and the screams of dying men. These factories symbolized the Soviet determination. Even in ruins, they continued to fight, producing death instead of steel. At the center of the defense was General Vasily Zhukov, commander of the 62nd Army. His headquarters was often just a dugout on the Volga's bank, constantly under bombardment. Zhukov rarely slept, driving his men with relentless determination. He issued strict orders, not one step back. Soldiers were to hold their ground or die where they stood. Desertion or retreat was punished by execution. Harsh as these measures were, they reflected the desperate reality. To abandon ground in Stalingrad was to invite collapse, and Zhukov would not allow collapse. The Soviet defenders paid dearly for every street. Losses were staggering. Companies of 200 men were often reduced to a dozen survivors after a week of fighting. Yet replacements, raw recruits, poorly trained militia, even wounded men sent back to the front, filled the gaps. The Volga crossing became a river of sacrifice. Reinforcements came across at night under constant artillery fire. Many boats never made it. Those who did often went into battle immediately, sometimes without rifles, expected to pick up weapons from the dead. Despite their suffering, the Soviets had accomplished something extraordinary. They had halted the German advance. By late October, the Sixth Army controlled about 90% of Stalingrad, but the Soviets still held critical pockets along the Volga, preventing total victory. The Germans had expected to take the city in weeks. Instead, they were trapped in a drawn-out bloodbath. The harsh Russian winter was approaching, supplies were running thin, and far to the north and south, Soviet armies were preparing for something far greater than defense. The German soldiers sensed it, though they could not name it yet. The longer they stayed in Stalingrad, the more it became a death trap. By November 1942, the German Sixth Army was exhausted, bled white by weeks of brutal urban combat. General Friedrich Paulus had committed almost all of his men into the inferno of Stalingrad itself, leaving his flanks stretching hundreds of miles across the steppe, dangerously exposed. And those flanks were not held by elite German troops. Instead, they were guarded by Germany's allies, Romanians, Italians, and Hungarians. Brave though many of them were, these soldiers lacked modern tanks, had little anti-tank weaponry, and were poorly supplied. Against the Red Army's growing strength, they were woefully vulnerable. Meanwhile, far from the smoking ruins of Stalingrad, the Soviets were quietly assembling massive reserves. Entire armies, hidden in the snow and fog of the steppe, prepared to strike. Joseph Stalin and his high command, the Stavka, had devised a bold plan, not merely to relieve pressure on Stalingrad, but to encircle and destroy the German Sixth Army. The codename was Operation Uranus. In the frozen November nights, trains thundered across the Soviet Union, delivering fresh troops, tanks, and artillery to secret staging grounds. Among these forces were the 5th Tank Army under General Romanenko and the 5th Shock Army under General Vatutin. The Soviets massed 1 million soldiers, 13,500 artillery pieces, 900 tanks, 1,000 aircraft. All carefully concealed behind camouflage nets, dummy positions, and strict radio silence. German aerial reconnaissance, deceived by Soviet maskirovka, deception tactics, failed to detect the scale of the threat. To the Germans inside Stalingrad, the front seemed stable. Paulus's men fought house to house, convinced victory was only weeks away. Few realized that the hunters were about to become the hunted. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. 2 massive pincers would strike the German flanks north and south of Stalingrad. These pincers would drive westward, aiming to meet at the town of Kalach on the Don River, cutting off the Sixth Army from all supply and escape. It was a strategy reminiscent of Hannibal at Cannae, a double envelopment on an epic scale. On the morning of November 19th, 1942, the silence of the steppe was shattered by a colossal Soviet artillery barrage. Thousands of guns roared as shells rained down on the Romanian Third Army, defending the northern flank. When the barrage lifted, waves of Soviet tanks and infantry advanced. T-34s crushed through trenches, infantry swarmed behind, and within hours the Romanian lines collapsed. Whole divisions disintegrated as Soviet armor poured through the breach. German reports spoke of chaos. "The Romanians are fleeing. Our flank is wide open." The next day, November 20th, the southern attack struck the Romanian 4th Army Corps near the Chir River. Once again, the lightly armed Romanians were overwhelmed. Soviet tanks smashed through with little resistance, driving north toward Kalach. The German commanders, shocked, pleaded for permission to retreat from Stalingrad to avoid encirclement. But Hitler, fixated on capturing the city named after his enemy, forbade withdrawal. "The 6th Army will hold Stalingrad," he ordered. "It will be supplied, it will not retreat." For 4 days, the pincers drove relentlessly across the frozen steppe. Soviet tanks raced over the snow, infantry clung to their hulls, and supply wagons rumbled behind. Villages were swallowed, retreating Axis forces scattered. On November 23, 1942, the two Soviet spearheads met at Kalach, west of Stalingrad. Soldiers from the northern and southern fronts embraced, firing flares into the sky. The jaws of the trap had closed. The German 6th Army, that over 300,000 men, was encircled. Inside Stalingrad, Paulus's soldiers could scarcely believe the news. One moment they were fighting for buildings, the next they were completely cut off, surrounded by Soviet armies. Morale plummeted. Supplies were already short, and now the army faced starvation. Fuel dwindled, ammunition stocks ran low, and winter bit hard. But Hitler refused to accept the truth. He assured Paulus that the Luftwaffe could supply the 6th Army by air, a promise that would soon prove disastrous. For the Soviets, Operation Uranus was a stunning success. After months of desperation and defense, they had seized the initiative. Not only had they saved Stalingrad, they had trapped one of the mightiest armies of the Wehrmacht. General Zhukov exulted. "The hunters have become the hunted. The fascist beast is trapped in its own cage." The encirclement of the 6th Army marked a turning point in the war, but the battle was far from over. The Germans would not surrender easily, and Hitler's pride would condemn hundreds of thousands of men to die in the freezing hell of the Stalingrad pocket. On November 23, 1942, the day the Soviet pincers met at Kalach, the fate of the German 6th Army was sealed. Over 300,000 Axis troops, Germans, Romanians, Croatians, and others, were now trapped in a vast cauldron, a frozen pocket stretching across Stalingrad and the steppe around it. At first, there was disbelief. Many German soldiers expected an immediate order to break out westward and escape the trap. General Friedrich Paulus himself knew this was the only chance of survival, but Hitler, far away in his Wolf's Lair headquarters, forbade retreat. "The 6th Army will stand fast. It will be supplied by air. Stalingrad will be held." Thus began the slow death of an army. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, promised Hitler that his air force could deliver 500 tons of supplies per day, enough to sustain the 6th Army. In reality, the battered Luftwaffe could barely manage 100 tons on good days. Winter storms, Soviet fighters, and inadequate transport planes made flights perilous. Many aircraft were shot down or forced to turn back. Instead of bread and ammunition, the starving soldiers often received crates of condoms, summer uniforms, or vodka, logistical blunders that became bitter jokes among the freezing men. By December, food rations had collapsed. Soldiers survived on 200 to 300 calories a day. Horses were slaughtered for meat. In desperation, men boiled leather belts and boots for sustenance. The once proud 6th Army was withering from within. Temperatures in the pocket plunged to -30 degrees Celsius, -22 degrees Fahrenheit. Soldiers lacked proper winter gear. Many still wore thin summer uniforms. Frostbite blackened fingers and toes, and thousands lost limbs without anesthesia. The wounded lay in unheated cellars, groaning in the dark. Supplies of morphine and bandages ran out. Gangrene spread unchecked. A German medic later recalled, "We could do nothing. They froze, they starved, they screamed until their voices broke." Then they were silent. Snowstorms turned the city into a white graveyard. Corpses littered streets, stacked like firewood. The living trudged past the dead, too weak to bury them. As food vanished, soldiers fought over crumbs. Bread baked with sawdust became a luxury. Dead horses were skinned within minutes of falling, their meat boiled in rusty helmets. Rumors spread of cannibalism, though official records remained silent. Desperation blurred the line between survival and horror. German diaries from the pocket are filled with haunting entries. Today, we ate the last of the bread. My hands are too cold to write. We are all waiting for death. Despite the suffering, discipline in many units held. Soldiers dug trenches, repaired weapons, and clung to orders. But morale was crumbling. Some officers whispered of surrender, but Hitler's orders were absolute: fight to the last bullet. Field Marshal Paulus, obedient to the end, refused to defy his Führer. Executions of defeatists took place. Men caught suggesting surrender were shot by their comrades. Fear of dishonor bound the army together, even as starvation tore it apart. Outside the pocket, the Red Army pressed closer. Soviet artillery pounded the trapped soldiers daily. Snipers hunted men who ventured into the open. Soviet loudspeakers broadcast taunts and propaganda across the lines. German soldiers, you are surrounded. Lay down your arms, you cannot escape. You will freeze, you will starve. Some surrendered in small groups, waving white cloths, but most stayed, clinging to a fading hope of rescue. In December 1942, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein launched Operation Winter Storm, a desperate attempt to break through and relieve the Sixth Army. His armored spearheads drove within 30 miles of Stalingrad, but Paulus was forbidden to attempt a breakout to meet them. Hitler's orders were unyielding. The Sixth Army will stand and hold. Relief will come to you. But relief never came. The Soviets repelled Manstein's forces, sealing the Sixth Army's fate. By January 1943, the pocket had shrunk to a fraction of its size. Ammunition was nearly gone. Soldiers fought with captured Soviet weapons or their bare hands. The men, skeletal and hollow-eyed, still resisted in ruins and cellars. But they were no longer an army. They were a starving mass of ghosts. In the final weeks, German soldiers wrote farewell letters, many never delivered. One officer scrawled, "Mother, I am cold. I have nothing to eat. The world has abandoned us. Forgive me." These fragments, found decades later, speak more powerfully than any history book of the frozen hell endured inside Stalingrad. By January 1943, the situation inside the Stalingrad pocket had become unbearable. The once proud Sixth Army, which had marched into Russia as one of Hitler's most powerful formations, was now reduced to starving skeletons. Out of the original 330,000 men, fewer than 100,000 were still combat effective. The Soviet grip tightened day by day. The Red Army's Operation Ring, launched in mid-January, unleashed massive artillery barrages, followed by coordinated infantry assaults. Entire German divisions disintegrated in hours. The pocket shrank to only a few square miles, divided into northern and southern zones. The Germans were no longer defending a city. They were clinging to piles of rubble. Even as the situation crumbled, Hitler refused to allow a surrender. From his Wolf's Lair headquarters, he demanded Paulus hold Stalingrad to the last man, the last round, the last bullet. On January 30th, 1943, the 10th anniversary of the Nazi rise to power, Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered, and Hitler expected Paulus to either hold or take his own life. But Paulus was no fanatic. He was a cautious, bureaucratic commander who obeyed orders but had no desire for suicide. He knew the battle was lost. On January 31st, 1943, Soviet troops broke into the German headquarters in the basement of a department store in Stalingrad. There they found Paulus and his staff. The once stoic general, disheveled and exhausted, offered no resistance. The southern pocket, about 90,000 men, surrendered with him. 2 days later, on February 2nd, the northern pocket under General Karl Strecker also collapsed. The last message Strecker sent to Germany was chillingly brief. The 11th Army Corps has fought to the last man. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. The surrender marked the single greatest disaster in German military history. Of the 330,000 Axis troops trapped in the pocket, only 91,000 went into Soviet captivity. The rest had been killed in combat, frozen to death, or starved. But captivity was no salvation. Soviet prison camps were brutal. Only about 5,000 of the 91,000 prisoners ever returned to Germany, most dying from hunger, disease, and forced labor in the years that followed. For the Soviets, the victory was immense, but equally costly. Stalingrad had devoured men like a furnace. The Red Army suffered over 1 million casualties, killed, wounded, or missing, in the defense and counteroffensives. The city itself was obliterated. Not a single building stood intact. Civilians who had survived the siege lived in cellars, surrounded by corpses and ruins. The defeat shattered the myth of German invincibility. For the first time, Hitler's armies had not just been stopped, but destroyed on a massive scale. The victory gave the Soviet Union confidence and momentum. From Stalingrad onward, the Red Army would begin a relentless westward push, through Kursk, across Ukraine, into Poland, and finally to Berlin. In Berlin, Hitler raged. He blamed his generals, his allies, and fate itself. But the truth was undeniable. His obsession with Stalingrad had bled his armies white. For the survivors, the end was a strange mixture of relief and despair. German soldiers laid down their weapons, numb with exhaustion, too weak to resist. Soviet soldiers, equally battered, often showed pity. Some shared bread or cigarettes with their defeated enemies. A Soviet war correspondent wrote, "They did not look like an army. They looked like men who had come back from the dead." The image of Paulus, the first German field marshal ever to be captured alive, became a symbol across the world. Hitler's arrogance humbled, his mighty war machine broken. News of the German defeat spread quickly. In Allied capitals, it was greeted with celebration. Winston Churchill called it the end of the beginning. In Germany, the propaganda machine tried to spin the disaster as heroic sacrifice, but the loss of an entire army was impossible to disguise. Quietly, faith in Hitler began to erode, both among civilians and the military elite. The surrender of the Sixth Army was more than a military defeat. It was a symbol of resilience, of human suffering, and of the shifting tide of World War II. For the Soviets, it was a triumph born of unimaginable sacrifice. For the Germans, it was the grave of their Eastern ambitions. Stalingrad was no longer just a city. It was a name carved into history, a word that meant destruction, endurance, and the turning of the tide. The Battle of Stalingrad was more than a clash between two armies. It was the hinge on which the fate of World War II turned. Before Stalingrad, Hitler's Wehrmacht had seemed unstoppable, sweeping through Poland, France, the Balkans, and deep into Soviet territory. After Stalingrad, the aura of invincibility was shattered. It was here, on the banks of the Volga, that the tide began to flow the other way. The Soviet Union, once thought to be on the brink of collapse, now stood defiant. The Red Army's victory announced to the world, Germany could be defeated. The surrender of an entire German field army reverberated across Europe. For the Allies, it was a beacon of hope. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill hailed it as the end of the beginning, a phrase that captured the shift from defense to offense. In Nazi Germany, however, the psychological blow was profound. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels tried to spin the defeat as heroic sacrifice, a Stalingrad myth that emphasized duty and loyalty to Hitler. But no amount of rhetoric could disguise the magnitude of the disaster. German families received no official lists of the dead. Letters simply stopped arriving. For the first time, ordinary Germans began to question the wisdom of the war. Stalingrad itself became a symbol of endurance. The city was virtually erased, its buildings reduced to rubble, its civilian population decimated. But its name lived on as a testament to resistance. Soviet propaganda portrayed it as a city that refused to bow, no matter the odds. After the war, Stalingrad, later renamed Volgograd, was rebuilt as a monument to Soviet resilience. Monuments like the Motherland Calls statue on Mamayev Kurgan became iconic, towering over the battlefield where so many had fallen. From the ashes of Stalingrad rose a new Soviet confidence. The Red Army, once battered and retreating, now seized the initiative. Within months, it would launch new offensives across the Eastern Front, culminating in the massive tank battle at Kursk in 1943. The battle also strengthened Stalin's position at home and abroad. The Soviet dictator, who had once feared collapse, now stood as one of the central figures in the Allied coalition. At the Tehran Conference in 1943, Stalin reminded Roosevelt and Churchill that it was the Soviet people who had broken the back of the German war machine. For the Germans, Stalingrad marked the beginning of a long retreat. The Wehrmacht would fight fiercely for 2 more years, but it would never regain its strategic initiative. Hitler's prestige among his generals was permanently damaged. His refusal to allow a retreat, his obsession with holding the city at all costs, had condemned an entire army to destruction. Even loyal officers began to see his judgment as fatally flawed. This erosion of trust would eventually contribute to resistance within the German military, including the failed July 20th plot of 1944 to assassinate him. The human cost of Stalingrad is almost beyond comprehension. Historians estimate 1.1 million Soviet casualties, killed, wounded, or captured, 800,000 Axis casualties, including Germans, Romanians, Italians, and Hungarians, 40,000 to 50,000 civilian deaths inside the city. It was one of the bloodiest battles in human history. Families across Europe and the Soviet Union were torn apart by its losses. The fate of the German prisoners added another layer of tragedy. Of the 91,000 taken captive, only about 5,000 survived to return home years later. For Germany, Stalingrad became not just a military defeat, but a national wound. The battle inspired countless books, films, and artworks. Soviet cinema turned it into an epic tale of heroism. German writers, meanwhile, often depicted it as a symbol of futility and the destruction of a generation. For historians, it remains a case study in strategy and human endurance, a battle that illustrates the dangers of overreach, the importance of logistics, and the resilience of defenders fighting for their homes. Stalingrad reshaped the war in multiple ways. It convinced Japan to abandon any plans of attacking the Soviet Union, leaving Stalin free to focus on the German front. It encouraged resistance movements across occupied Europe, proving the Nazis could be defeated. It solidified the Grand Alliance between the US, Britain, and the Soviet Union, paving the way for D-Day and the liberation of Western Europe. The Battle of Stalingrad was not just a Soviet victory, it was a turning point in the history of the 20th century. From the rubble of the Volga, the trajectory of World War II was altered. It remains a symbol of sacrifice, endurance, and the terrible price of war. Stalingrad showed that human willpower, even when battered and starved, can change the course of history. The echo of its gunfire faded long ago, but its legacy endures in the memorials that rise over the Volga, in the lessons of military strategy, and in the collective memory of nations. Stalingrad was where the Nazi Empire began to die, and it is remembered rightly as the battle that saved Europe.